So the Tamron 50-400mm lens versus the Nikon 100-400mm lens for the Z mount. So I have a bunch of landscape shots here that I captured with the lenses. Now these are all raw files, and I have made some minor white balance and exposure adjustments just so we can see what's going on a little bit better, but I haven't modified the sharpening or detail or anything like that. Now most of these images were shot at f8 and ISO 64 using the 45 megapixel Nikon Z7II, and the Tamron can obviously shoot wider than the Nikon, but for this video we're going to be looking at overlapping focal lengths. So I have some shots at 100mm, 200mm, 300mm, and 400mm. Alright, well let's go ahead and take a look at our first comparison. So globally you can see that there's really not a big difference, though I am noticing a little bit more vignette going on in the corners on the Tamron, and that's easily fixed in editing though. And taking a look at the center of the frame, we can see that both images are very sharp. The color and contrast are identical to my eye. And here on the edges of the frame, I'm noticing a sharper image on the Nikon by maybe a notch or two, but overall I'd say that the images are about 90% the same here at 100mm. Let's take a look at another 100mm shot, and a similar thing going on with the vignette in this shot. And taking a look in the center, I'm basically seeing great detail coming out of both lenses. And taking a look at these peaks in the back, I'm noticing slightly more contrast from the Tamron. Good sharpness from both lenses though. And then here on the edges, I'm once again seeing a sharper result from the Nikon. And same thing on this other edge. But you don't have to move towards the center too far before the images start looking pretty much identical. Alright, so next up we have some 200mm shots. And once again there's more vignette on the Tamron. And for this shot I focused on the trees, so let's look there as the peak is slightly out of focus in both of these shots. And here in the center, both images are very sharp, and I really can't say that one looks better than the other here. And out on the edges, we're once again seeing a sharper, more detailed image being produced by the Nikon lens. Now I wouldn't say that the Tamron is bad, it's still perfectly usable, but the Nikon is giving us more clarity on the edges. Now these next shots are a little bit short of 200mm, but it's close enough for some comparisons. Now I've focused on the trees in the foreground for this image, and I do have some shots where I've focused on the background as well, but let's go ahead and take a look at these corners. And just like previous examples, I'm seeing more clarity and sharpness on the Nikon, but the Tamron still looks pretty good. I'm also noticing some slight color differences here. Seems like the Tamron has more magenta tones in many of these areas. And taking a look at the other shots where I focus on the background, I see great sharpness coming out of both lenses. Really not seeing much difference between the shots. They both look pretty good to me. Alright, so here's our next example, this time at 300mm. And let's go ahead and take a closer look at the center. And I'm seeing razor sharp results coming out of them both. Tons of detail. And to my eye, they are identical here. And if we move out to the edges, they are both looking very good still. I think the Tamron is performing better on the edges at 300mm than it did at 100 and 200mm. I honestly don't see much difference between these shots until I get to the corner where the Nikon is noticeably sharper. And here's another 300mm example. Let's take a closer look at this glacier here. Both images are very sharp. I love the level of detail coming out of both of these lenses. As I look at the edges and the corner, I once again am seeing a sharper image being rendered by the Nikon. The Tamron gets a little soft out here, but still looks good overall. Alright, so next let's take a look at some 400mm images. I'm seeing slightly more contrast in the Tamron here. And in terms of sharpness in the center of the frame, to me, it looks like both images are a little bit softer than what we were seeing at the other focal lengths, but overall they are still giving good sharpness and detail. And if we look at the corners, there is really not much difference here. They both are getting slightly softer, and this time I can't really say that the Nikon is better. These lenses seem to be giving us pretty much identical levels of sharpness at 400mm. And here's another 400mm image. Once again, there's more vignette coming out of the Tamron, but it's not a huge deal. And taking a look at the center of the images, I'm seeing a lot of fine detail and sharpness from both lenses, but again, not as good as we saw from the other focal lengths. And to me, it does look like the Nikon is slightly sharper, but I'm thinking I may have been ever so slightly out of focus on the Tamron, since the images were essentially identical for the previous 400mm shot that we looked at. And then here on the edges, it's a similar story. Alright, so after looking at all these images, what are my conclusions here? Well, I'd say that overall we are getting great results out of both lenses. They both produce a ton of detail, and I'd have no issue shooting with either one of them. Now, the Nikon does tend to give us sharper, more detailed edges and corners, but the image quality is essentially the same when it comes to the rest of the frame. So if I had to put a number to it, I'd say that the Nikon overall is a 9 out of 10, whereas the Tamron is an 8 out of 10. You know, it's really not too far off from each other at all. Some other things to note as well is that the Tamron is like half the price of the Nikon. You know, it weighs less, though I still wouldn't consider it a lightweight lens or anything. It can shoot wider at 50mm, and at those wider focal lengths it has a closer focusing distance that enables a 1:2 macro reproduction ratio. That's pretty cool. So what do I recommend if you're contemplating getting one of these lenses? Well, I'd say that if money isn't an issue and you want that extra sharpness on the corners and the edges, and you want the extra third of a stop of light on the long end, then get the Nikon. You know, it's an awesome lens, no question about it. On the other hand, if you want to save some money and you're okay with the drop in clarity on the edges and corners, go for the Tamron. It really is a good bang for the buck. Now keep in mind as well that I didn't test out autofocus for things like wildlife and whatnot, so that might be another factor to consider if you're into wildlife photography. I'm guessing that the first party lens will be better in that regard, but I can't really say for sure. So if you have some knowledge about it, please leave a comment and let me and everyone else know. If you do decide to purchase either one of these lenses, I definitely appreciate you using my affiliate links in the description of this video. It helps support this channel and it doesn't cost you anything extra when using them, so thank you very much for that. The video description also contains a discount code for Sandmark gear if you are interested in that. Alright, well that's it for now. I'll see you next time.